Hi, my name is Erin, and welcome to my talk about code cowpokes and word wranglers. This is a talk about the people who write the docs, the people who write the code, and how we can collaborate. So we're all here at this conference because we value fantastic documentation, no matter our job title, whether we're a manager, an information architect, an engineer, a tech writer. We all value delivering fantastic docs, whether they're internal or customer facing. So what I'd like to ask is, how are the structures and organizations that we are part of helping us make this value of great docs a reality? Or how are these structures getting in our way? And what can we do about it? Because not only are we here out of our passion for docs, we're here because we value one another. And that really gets to the heart of what this conference means to me. So I've attended Write the Docs a couple of times. I was very lucky to get to attend that one in Portland way back in 2013. And what a revelation this conference was for me. So many tech conferences are focused on delivering more, delivering faster, hyper efficiency. What I loved about Write the Docs was the attention to mindfulness and focus and building the right things. I still have my notes from that first conference. And as I look back on them in preparation for this talk, it really struck me how some of the things I learned, I was able to put into practice right away. And other things, I remember having this reaction like, oh, this is fantastic. I'd love to be able to do that someday. I'm not in a place where I can do that right now. But now looking back on the notes, I'm realizing I've now been in workplaces where I've been able to apply more and more of what I've seen from these notes. In other words, almost 10 years later, the practices that I learned about at Write the Docs are still bearing fruit. So talk about playing the long game. That's why I love that Write the Docs adopted the sloth as the informal mascot. So a little more specifically, looking back at those notes, I kind of see a pattern in an implicit question I was asking myself as I reacted to what the presenters were saying. There were questions like, how do I tell developers what's new in my API? How do I lay out blocks of text on a web page for comprehension? How do I say more with less? How do I communicate more effectively and clearly? So the approach I had been taking in attending this conference was, how do I do this one individual practice? And that's an absolutely fine framing to use. That's where I was at in my career. But looking back, I now kind of want to think a little more about how do we take these individual practices and make them part of our workplace culture? Now, there's still individual things we do as people to get our culture there. So a little more glibly, how do I get to how do we? And that's really the theme song of this talk. I'm not going to be coming at you with guaranteed recipes that 100% work. We know that that's not how this works. But I'm here today with stories about times when collaboration across job titles and roles has succeeded and times when it hasn't. So in part one of the talk, the shortest part of the talk, I'll be talking about how the effort to foster this culture is worth it, does pay off. In the next part, I'll tell a few stories of success in collaborating across roles. And finally, we'll talk about ways that I have seen workplace cultures incorporate a sense of collaboration. So I don't think I have to sell the people at this conference on the value of documentarians, engineers working together. The effort is worth it. But I'd just like to spend a couple of minutes riffing on this a little bit. This sentence does have two parts. It is effort. It takes mindful practice and energy to get a collaborative atmosphere going in a workplace. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And one of those is, in some workplaces, we face explicit external pressure from managers, from higher ups, from stakeholders saying, hey, engineers, don't bother the tech writers. They're busy getting ready for this release. Or, hey, tech writers, don't bother the engineers. And even when there's not an explicit directive not to collaborate, sometimes the tools that we're stuck with don't make it easy. We'll talk about that a little bit later. I'm not against specialized tools, but some are better than others. And if that weren't enough, if we weren't already facing all this external pressure, we also put a lot of pressure on ourselves not to bother other people because we're all busy. And look, I made up a graph that proves it. This is the only place really I will just make a bold assertion and not back it up by at least a story. Because I think we can take it as axiomatic that we all have ever deepening backlogs and urgent deadlines. And so I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves not to step out of our lane and do something off script. So it is effort. It is also worth it. So worth it. I have personally seen close collaboration with documentarians and developers lead to happier contributors. I've seen tech writers report a much more satisfying experience when they can get an answer live from an engineer or write something together. I've seen engineers happy because they are seeing how people outside the team are actually seeing and using the software and how it works and where the stumbling blocks are. Me personally, this is reason enough to foster a sense of collaboration. I don't think we need any other reasons or justifications. Happy contributors leads to better retention. As a manager, that's something I care about. However, there are other benefits. I've seen close collaboration lead, of course, to better docs as we unearth more corner cases that need to be explained to customers and things like that. I've also seen it lead to much better software because at some point, if the software feature is so difficult to use that we can't properly explain it to our docs team, that's a huge clue for us that we can improve our software, and I've seen it happen. And of course, when we have better docs and better software, we also have happier customers. So I'd like to tell a few success stories that I've encountered in my current position. So this is not going to be an advertisement for our work. I do want to talk a little bit about it just to set the context for the examples I'm going to show you. So I work at a company called Breeza. We're building an online insurance marketplace for small businesses. It turns out if you're hanging out your shingle as a CPA or as a hairstylist or as a building contractor, getting commercial insurance should be as easy as going and getting car insurance, fill out a form on a website, get some quotes. Turns out it's not that easy. So for car insurance, every insurer wants to know the same things. What kind of car do you drive and where do you drive it and when do you drive it? But for small businesses, every insurance company wants to know something different. Plus, the specific questions they ask you are going to vary widely based on what kind of business you are. Somebody who runs a snowplow business is going to get asked different questions than somebody who runs an accounting firm. So it's a problem that sounds simple, but is actually very challenging to do. Those are my favorite things to work on. Okay, so first example, documentation serving as kind of a caution sign that we might be headed in the wrong direction generally. So we are an API first company. Our API is our core product, but we do have a website that we built on top of that API. So the website lets people fill out an insurance questionnaire. It's a nice proof of concept that you can deliver a good user experience on top of our API. Plus, this does give us the freedom if we choose to build some kind of hybrid hybrid UI API product, we could choose to do that in the future. So this website is called a Smart Portal. It used to be called the Binder, which is a more technical insurance term, and realized that was a bit jargony, and so we changed it. And then our documentation specialist came along and was updating our draft docs, which were a work in progress. And when she came on board, she started exhaustively looking for where the gaps were between our docs and our systems. And she found this field. The properties of an insurance brokerage has binder access. And she said, what's this? We're like, oh, yeah, we don't call that the binder anymore. Oops, except the API still does. And as I said, we hadn't gotten around to documenting this field yet in our early drafts. And so she had a lot of great questions about this field, and asking what's that field name, that was just the beginning. By the way, we did rename the field. And as an aside, I'll talk about safe ways to make changes like this to an API. If you need to rename a payload field, assuming that's the thing you want to do, assuming you're not just going to version the API and roll it, you can instrument your code and find out who's using this endpoint and who's using this field. You can announce to them the change you're making and give them a generous deadline. This is also a place where your tech writer can come in handy crafting that message. For a short time, you can allow your customers to use both the old and the new field names. You instrument who's still using the old one in your logging system, in your monitoring system, and work with those customers to get them migrated, and then only clean up after you've proven that nobody's using the old one anymore. Anyway, back to the topic of docs. Beyond just the field name, this led to a much bigger philosophical question: is why is a user interface specific detail? Does this brokerage have access to the smart portal? Why is that part of the API? The smart portal is only one user interface, and in general, we don't want to have a specific user interface's details encoded in the API. So this led to a fantastic question about separating the roles and getting more UI specific stuff out of the API. So that's docs as a caution signal about our general direction. Now I'd like to talk about docs as advocating for a better developer experience, better usability of an API. So the way that people apply for insurance through us is first they answer a couple of questions just to see if we're a good fit for them. If we know that none of our insurance partners can support that business, no need to make somebody fill out a long questionnaire. Once this person says, yes, I want to keep going, then we generate a custom questionnaire just for them based on their business and location. And they fill it out, they get some quotes, they pick one they like, and then they pay for a policy. So the way that works in our API is first you create that initial sort of pre-screening questionnaire. We call it a pre-application using a post endpoint. Post has a real world effect. It creates a questionnaire. Then the developer partner gathers the answers from their policyholder and patches them into the pre-application. Then they create an application from that pre-app. Show that questionnaire to their policyholder. They fill out the questions. The developer patches those results back in. Then they post to the quotes endpoint. And at that point, we send API requests out to a bunch of different insurance carrier partners and queue up a background job to get the answers back from them. So this is causing real things to happen. Every time we hit one of these posts, we're creating a questionnaire, we're sending out API requests to carrier partners. And anytime there's a patch, that's just sending in application answers back into our system. And it's a pretty passive thing. So our whole system works according to this pattern until we get to creating an actual insurance policy and paying for it and making it a legal agreement. And now you post to policies and basically nothing happens. And then when you patch in the payment details, that's the thing that causes your credit card to get billed and causes your insurance to be bound, meaning like it's a legal document now. And we're looking at this as our doc specialist is asking us how payment works. And we're like, how do we explain this with a straight face? Like, oh yeah, this one endpoint is different. Everywhere else, patch is this sort of safe data update thing to do, but this one part here, it causes your credit card to get charged. This one part here, it creates a legal agreement and causes it to go into effect. So fortunately, this endpoint was still unreleased. Only the smart portal was using it. So before release, we changed it. We said, now the post, just like the rest of our API, the post is the thing that causes live API calls to go out to payment partners and insurance carriers. We don't even need the patch anymore. So this is much more in line with the rest of our API. And it was the docs, the process of writing the docs together that caught this inconsistency. So I'd also like to talk about docs as a signal about our architecture or our design. So when I showed you those URLs earlier, that's how they work now, but that's not how they used to work. So the way we used to name our resources is that they were deeply nested. You would have an application / some unique ID number / quotes / a sequential integer / policies. So putting that in English, the insurance policies for the third quote for this one specific application. And so we saw that a bias was hiding in our own naming. And this came out in our talks with um, documentation people and product people about how to make this API better. The bias was that a policy must belong to a quote as a sub resource, only accessible through that quote. And a quote can only belong to an application. Now, certainly policies, quotes, and applications are all associated, but that's different than saying the only way to get to a quote is through an application. That's a very different proposition. And that was constraining the things that developers could express in their code. With this URL scheme, there was no way to make a request that says, well, just show me all the policies I've created for all of my policyholders. There was no way to say, for this one insurance brokerage, which quotes didn't get quoted for whatever reason. Now, maybe there's a way to do that by enumerating through every possible application and then spidering through all the dependent quotes and policies, but that's a terrible developer experience. Now, there was a reason for this API scheme. Initially, it met our needs. It met the needs of everyone using the API. It also was the easiest way for us to get going, because having the resource IDs embedded in the URL like that meant we didn't have to do a bunch of extra database queries to go find these other coordinating objects. And it also meant that we could use a very simple session token-based authentication. So this was saving the engineers time, which is a good thing initially when you're getting off the ground. But eventually, we don't want, well, it's going to take more engineering effort to be our customer's problem, right? We want that to be our problem, not their problem. So we bit the bullet and flattened out that URL hierarchy. We said, okay, applications, policies, quotes, these are all first-class citizens in the API. They all get a top-level route. We're going to give them all unique IDs. None of this trying to guess whether we use an integer or an ID for this thing. And this new resource naming design can express things that were inexpressible before. As I mentioned, now it's possible to say, show me all the policies I've created, show me all the quotes I've created. In order to do this, we had to prioritize a more API key focused authentication scheme. This was always on the map. I was looking forward to it since day one when I started the company. And this was the perfect chance for us to add that new authentication scheme that made those top level URLs make sense. So those are 3 examples of places where close collaboration between engineering and documentation have caused not only the docs to be better, but also the software to be massively better, and in some cases, the engineering direction where we're headed. So what are some ways that we've seen this succeed in our own organizations? How do we foster that sense of collaboration? So there's a few different categories. Some of them are very informal and some of them are very baked into your organizations. So I'd like to just do a scattershot tour through these categories. Not everything is going to apply to everyone, but hopefully this will spark some ideas and ways to make changes in your own organization. So first, the back channel approach, the informal approach. Some organizations are very siloed and docs and engineering are just kept far apart. Moreover, some organizations are inflexible. So there's really no way to change that. As I've also mentioned, sometimes the tools just don't make collaboration easy. If there's a tool that only one person can use and nobody even has read access to it, then copy and paste an email might be your only way to collaborate, and that can lead to slow turnaround and frustrating experience for everyone. At one job, the documentation had to be edited through a very specific set of word processor macros. And not even all the writers had them, I don't think. So you had to go to specific writers to get certain documentation changed. It was a very kind of patched together system. So engineers never really got to see the in-progress docs. We could see a final rendered product and make suggestions on it, but we couldn't do things like view deltas. And it made for a very difficult experience, plus all those pressures not to bother the documentation people. So in these situations, sometimes the only thing you can do is kind of work through informal back channels and take your documentarian out to lunch, take your engineer out to lunch. It doesn't mean you have to talk about work stuff. I don't want to push people to be working on their own time, This is more about just fostering rapport, and maybe together you can find some ways to collaborate that are more conducive. Maybe some pair programming, pair documentation writing, maybe an offsite where you're kind of free of those managerial pressures for a few hours. So yeah, take your documentarian out to lunch or to a robotics demo. So at this job I was referring to, our amazing tech writer found a local school that we were going to be donating an oscilloscope to, a piece of lab equipment. And she arranged a robotics demo. We were going to use the oscilloscope to troubleshoot a problem in a robot's firmware. And so one of the UI designers and she and I went to this school and did this presentation. There's my friend Tony with a robot with a deadly spork headed straight at him as we're talking about how to verify the robot's behavior is correct before we put him in danger. And this was just something that came out informally through us befriending one another. So don't underestimate these informal back channel ways to foster relationships and foster rapport. Sometimes that's all you have, but sometimes that little much is huge. So semi-formal approaches. So sometimes your organization will have built-in ways to offer people some kind of incentive or reward for collaborating. So more generally, how does your organization reward awesomeness? Do you have any kind of nomination for peer-to-peer monetary awards? Spot awards, I think some places call them. I've been at places where we have these, and if you have these, absolutely use those. When your documentarian comes in and saves your bacon by stopping you from shipping a bad feature, when your engineer comes to you with half-baked, amazing starter material for a brand new feature so you're not starting from cold, thank them monetarily, nominate them for one of these awards. If your organization doesn't have a formal way to give something of value, whether it's cash or some kind of prize, see if you can do it a little semi-informally. See if your manager will expense a Starbucks gift card or a lunch. Call it a business lunch, expense it. Again, get approval. Please don't get fired. I've also been in organizations that had literal, physical, tangible goods to thank people for collaborating. At New Relic, the security group would give you a patch containing the likeness of this fictional security researcher named Lord Viper Scorpion. And they would give this to you if you helped find a potential security vulnerability in our systems. I still have that patch somewhere in one of these boxes. I treasure it. I love it. So if your organization could maybe you ship a nerd merit badge for an engineer shipping a docs patch or something like that. There's a lot of opportunity for creativity here. By the way, speaking of shipping a docs patch or shipping a security fix, is there any way that writers and devs at your organization can get partial access to one another's tools? So again, at New Relic, the engineers had draft access to the content management system that the writers used. So obviously the writers can and should be the only ones who have publish access. But if an engineer is building a new feature and they want to kind of start the ball rolling with a little bit of starter content, I know that the docs people I worked with were super happy when we did that. Or if I were modifying the behavior of a feature, I could submit a proposal for a change to the docs. So if there's any way to get access to one another's tools, at my workplace, the docs people also have access to the source code. So if they want to clarify something in addition to what we've answered with their questions, they can always jump into the code and take a look. I don't want to say reading the code is the only or the first place that people should have to look for an engineering answer, but sometimes just to answer a quick question is helpful. So what are your organization's channels for recognizing people? Even if it's informally, nothing of cash value is exchanged. My company has a kudos channel in Slack. Our documentation got a public compliment from a job applicant who found it very easy to help them get started. So I made sure to let everyone know this was thanks to the hard work of our documentarian. So yeah, please remind your colleagues of how awesome they are. And if you have a good trusting rapport with their manager, let their manager know too, right before performance review time. I have a separate talk exactly on this topic of writing down the awesome things your teammates do and then sharing it. It's called Dossier's Awesome. You can pursue that in your own time. And as you share your success stories internally in your organization, if it's available, please quantify the impact. That makes it even cooler. This person saved us 2 months of rework by helping us talk through this API design feature. Managers notice these things. When I'm writing a promotion pitch for someone, you bet I like to see lots of evidence come in from people all over the company of awesome stuff this person has done. So let's talk about more formal structural ways to bake collaboration right into your organization. So one thing you can do is make documentation part of your software process. And I'm not going to propose any big fancy framework for this. I'm just going to propose, ask your documentation person, how could this be better? How could your experience working with us be better? We have gotten so many ideas just by asking this question. One thing that came out of this, our documentation person told us, sometimes when I'm tagged in a feature that I need to go document, I need to know who's the audience for this feature. What's the pain in their life that this feature solves? What are the new allowable values for every field? What are the data types? Let me see some example use. And so she suggested an issue template in our ticket tracker for documentation requests. Another example is we asked her how we could make her life better, and she mentioned in pull requests, if she gets tagged in, can the pull request description have enough information in it for her to add to the docs? So there's now a checklist item on the pull request, and we have a special label for pull requests that will affect the documentation. So I've been talking about public-facing documentation so far, but I'd also like to ask, how else can we infuse collaboration on the docs throughout the software process? So here I think about like the RFC style process, request for comment, where when you're beginning to propose a feature, you'll write a brief description of what this feature is, just enough technical information to show that this is probably feasible, and get people to weigh in on this. And then stamp it, freeze it in time, and set that up as a record of a technical decision that the organization has made. Stitch Fix was really good about this. They called them architectural design records, architectural decision records. And so it's a way of baking in not just public-facing customer documentation, but internal historical documentation so people can understand the why of a feature. So in addition to making documentation part of your process, can you make it part of your organization, the way your teams are structured? Can you dedicate an engineer's time to your writing team, even just on a short-term basis? Can you embed can you embed a writer on your engineering team? Part-time, informally, ad hoc, maybe during a down week between milestones. So my team on paper is all engineers, but in practice, we are a multidisciplinary team with a writer and product manager and a support person. We're a cross-cutting team, and so we need the input from those people. So those folks are part of our team in most of the ways that matter. They are full participants in our planning sessions, our retrospectives, our team lunches, our celebrations, and our recognition. We make sure that when we get recognized for shipping something, they get recognized too. So I've talked about a lot of different approaches here. The ones that will apply to you will depend vastly on your situation, on your role, and on how much clout and privilege that you have within your organization. If you are a very heavily engineering-focused organization, and you feel like your tech writers might be kind of pushed off to the side, look for ways to lift them up and highlight their achievements and get them recognized for building fantastic docs with you. If you're a very documentation-focused organization and your engineers are kind of sidelined, what are ways to include them more? If you're a manager, if you're a director, what are ways that you can change the structure of your organization to put the reward structures in place and the team structures in place for collaboration? So that's all I have. Thank you so much for your time. I'd love to continue this conversation. My contact info is here on this slide. Also, we're hiring. We're staffed up on tech writers at the moment, but that can always change. And we're always looking for engineers and product people, support people, and so on. So give us a look. All right. Enjoy the rest of the conference, folks. Thanks for watching.
Yeah, so I guess we can get started. I wanted to thank all of you for coming in, and I thought it was a really cool theme to end on for this block of talks and for the second day and for the conference in general, because um, for both of your talks, you're talking about how to get people to work together, playing to their strengths. A lot of the time a company will face this problem and we'll go, oh, do we need like a fancy new tool? Do we need to hire new people? And sometimes the answers are the people who are already working with us and around us and already like kind of enmeshed in our worlds already. So I think it was really cool, rather than chasing big fancy solutions, to kind of look in and see how we can make our own processes better and more collaborative. So I thought that was really fun. And yeah, I think it's a nice takeaway for the end of the second day. So yeah, I've got some questions that I can launch into. You can let me know if there are any that you saw in the chats that you thought were really, you really wanted to sink your teeth into. One question that I got for Leanne and Gretchen is, how do you maintain a single source of truth when you have a lot of technologists working on the same thing? Somebody's got to unmute.
I can take that one, Leonie. When we started, the bar was really, really, really low. Like, there was information like in nooks and crannies all over the internet of GitHub and Google Docs, and part of the normal things that you would do in an audit to root out some of that stuff, we weren't able to do. So just bringing everything under one roof, like into one site, it was the tooling. We didn't get into the tooling, but we used Confluence plus Confluence Cloud plus Scroll Viewport. Shout out to the Scroll Viewport people. I saw some names I recognized. It worked out really well for us. But just getting it all under one roof, like, and publishing things, it's a little painful, but like, oh, look, there's 3 documents about the same thing. What should we do about that? Like, is kind of the forcing mechanism that needs to happen in order to get attention on it. And it's not like maybe ideal or the best way to approach it, but when you push it out there and publish it and see that like there's conflicting information or duplicative information and it's published, that's a good way to shine a spotlight on when the documentation is not the single source of truth. But driving everybody to the new set of information and making it a better experience than what there was there before was part of our solution for them.
Yeah, and to add on to what Gretchen was saying, I guess I see 2 parts of single source of truth. There's how is this particular piece of this hub of documentation the thing to hold canon, and that's like one aspect of source of truth. And then within that, like, oh, there are many parts within the documentation hub. Which is part A, like, is more valid than part B? Who knows? Because they're all the customer doesn't know. And so for part A, that relates, part A being why is this particular documentation hub held more highly in regard? That was everybody talks about it. It's just a reinforced message that all of the 100 other people in our program just hammered to our customers day in and day out. And that was in various ways. Overtly, we would say, and then go to the documentation hub, and then covertly of saying, oh, I see you need information about XYZ. Here is a link. And it just so happens to be the documentation hub. And then for the other parts of like, why is there's a documentation hub and maybe page A and page B are conflicting. What is true? I think that actually links to another question that I saw in chat, which was like, how do we add documentation writing and editing to the product development timeline? And the answer right now, and Gretchen is grinning, is we don't. We kind of just hope, but it's one of those next steps of something that we're trying, which is creating that meta view so other teams can see, oh, this is what's wrong. Oh, maybe there's conflicts that we should fix. It's not something that we've done, but it is an initiative for right now. And so by melding into the product development timeline, that allows more visibility and what do we call it, Gretchen? We can use our Rachel hammer, our clients. So we have our clients being able to say, oh, well, since we're a product-led environment, surely there should not be conflicts in your roadmap, that sort of thing.
Cool. And maybe a follow-up question about resourcing is the question from Dylan in the chat. Did you have trouble getting technologists to actively participate in creating docs due to their other priorities? Like, how do you get time allocated for them to work on the docs specifically? Can you? Have you? We all want to know.
Do you want to take this one?
Sure. Well, we were fortunate in our scenario that we had a lot of we had top-down support for this. Like, it was made an initiative at the top level of our program that hey, we're moving everything over to this new documentation site, and it was mandated that every team work into their roadmap for the year for 2021. You need to move your docs from wherever they are over to this new experience. Clean them up if you please, but if you have time, add new stuff. So having that top level support, so if you don't have that, trying to figure out how to get that is a really effective lever to pull to get support for getting people to create docs. But not everybody had a lot of time to clean up things as they move them over. And so then that was kind of the behind the scenes work of doing some research on what was there and setting up instrumentation for feedback and analytics, so that as everybody was moving their information and after they did, we were able to synthesize, kind of triangulate the data points, and then go back to leadership and get ahead of planning to say, hey, this is a priority area. We think maybe we should work with this team on their docs, and then aligning resources kind of on whatever your cadence is for planning throughout the year, and kind of getting ahead of it that way.
Great, thank you. I've got some questions for Erin. I think just the API world and writers' involvement in it really struck a chord with people. So we've got a couple questions about API governance guidelines. Does your team set them? If so, how do you coordinate with product delivery to enforce those guidelines? And how can writers contribute to API governance guidelines? So big questions.
Right. So starting with involving tech writers early, a lot of this gets to that RFC process that I was talking about, where when we get an idea for something we feel like should be a feature, we get the ball rolling with an internal facing document and get the tech writers involved as soon as possible. They're excellent at spotting features that are not going to be simple and easy to use and easy to explain to customers. And that's one thing I love about our documentation specialist, is the way she leaps in to those discussions and helps us set the tone right. Often, as we're designing a feature, we don't know what's the best approach, and we'll outright say, here's a few different possibilities for this endpoint. What do you think? We'll tag her in and see what she has to say. So my team does have a lot of leeway to set our process there, and we've just made that our process. We've said, this is the way we want to do things. And that also gets back to including her as part of the team means that she gets to help define the process. I think there was another question there about enforcement. We honestly haven't run into that a whole lot. We don't have a lot of people bypassing RFCs. It's also a way that engineers get recognized for building features and getting consensus on what makes for a good feature. So it helps our engineers as well.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Were there more questions in there? I know there were a few different facets to this.
Oh, I just kind of threw them at you. So it's a great answer. Thank you. We had another question. You gave us such a great case study in the insurance world, and Jen was wondering, how could you abstract the value of the docs, the writers, or documentarian contributions to the code or the API to product in other industries? Do you have any thoughts on what that could look like?
Yes, I feel like some of these things aren't super duper industry specific. Mm-hmm. And certainly the other companies I've worked at have been in very different industries. So a lot of things I feel are, if not universal, at least broadly applicable. Mm-hmm. And one thing that gives me hope about that is an answer that Leonie and Gretchen gave a minute ago about seeing people recognized and making sure they get recognized for collaboration, that it's part of the reward structure. And I loved hearing that, because that gives me hope that these sorts of practices apply in lots of industries. Also, while I'm talking about your talk, I loved the way that you talked about using metrics to support the people making the documentation. Here's where you've made good use of templates. Here's where this could have been better. And like, not as a cudgel from management, but as a support tool for the people doing the work.
Oh, that's so nice. Yeah, I totally agree. So nice to think about more like the carrot rather than the stick. I think sometimes we need to do that. We got a question that I think could apply to everybody. So maybe I'll start with Leonie and Gretchen, then get back to you, Erin. It's one of those general questions of where do you go from here? How do you take the ideas that you all talked about today and then use it for future growth? And what would you like to do with those ideas in the future? Oh, pet break. We need more pet breaks. I'll pass it on to the rest of the organizers. Leonie and Gretchen, does one of you want to take a stab at it? Doesn't need to be perfect. You got great thinky faces so far.
Yeah. So it was, I know we were practicing. So the question was, we've learned stuff. Are we going
what's
to
next?
do anything with the stuff that we've learned, basically?
Yeah.
I think that this work that Gretchen, myself, and Amy that I shouted out at the beginning of the talk, it all came together in like a year, 2 years, a year and a half.
Wow.
And I think what the biggest accomplishment that we use the word consulting a lot in our field, the biggest bit of consulting that we've been able to do is, yes, we can treat content as a product, and it can work if you squint. And you just kind of make things, like adjust things. But also, we've impressed upon the clients that not all writers are the same. So not all a tech writer A versus tech writer B, not the same, let alone tech writers versus UX writers versus content strategists, also not the same. I would say those are the two biggest frictions that we faced. And going forward, I'm optimistic that our clients will be behind that when we make recommendations for staffing changes or whatnot. They'll be like, oh yeah, we buy in. We understand where you're coming from.
Great. Gretchen, do you have anything to add, or do you want to move on to Erin?
I'd love to see for the balance of I don't know specifically if it's like the publishing speed versus the editorial rigor, like kind of shift a little bit, see how much we can do without making people feel like they're having to compromise their speed, but also improves like rigor wise, if it's increasing adoption of the templates and finding kind of behind the scenes creative ways to get people to write better from the get-go, and whatever that looks like, whatever those solutions shake out to be, without making people feel like we're too much up in their business and slowing them down. But if we do have to slow things down a little bit, that it feels like the right time, and it feels, that everybody's, that we're not just like dropping the editorial hammer out of nowhere on that it's kind of a gradual process towards that.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Erin and Jolene, what do you think?
She's growling because my son has a friend over.
Oh no.
She's like, I just got here, but I've already learned there's infinite peanut butter, and I want to protect that.
I would too. I'm allergic to peanut butter, and I still would. When I've gotten a good thing. Yeah, Aiden, I thought the same thing. We thought that she was just being shy.
Sorry, was there another question for me?
Yeah, just the same one. Just where do you go from here? How do you want to take the lessons that you were talking about in your talk and then bring it to like future growth?
For sure. One of them, because we're a fairly new company, is we don't have a lot of structures in place for the kind of like tangible rewards. I'd love to see us have some spot awards that people could nominate each other for. And so I'll be pursuing that with our director at some point. And let's see, other stuff, I'd love to see us have more writers, because we've got, I think when you, as y'all know, when you have more than one person, the power of collaboration multiplies rather than adds. So I would love to have us staff an additional writer position, especially as we look at other engineering projects that we've got on the roadmap.
Great. Well, I wanted to thank you. We're at time, and there are always questions that we can't get to, but I think in the chat, Sherry really made a great point. I appreciate how all the speakers are so candid about the hard stuff and acknowledge they're not where they want to be yet. I think that makes us all feel better. You know, it's one thing when you have a talk and they're like, I've done it and it's perfect now and it will always be perfect. And nobody can ever relate to that kind of talk. You always kind of side eye it because you're like, does this situation never really exist? So when you talk honestly about the challenges that you've run into, the ongoing work that you've put into solving them, and the lessons that you've learned, like I think that's the most actionable stuff, and that's what I think people really connect with. So I wanted to thank the three of you and your colleagues who helped but can't be here. I think it's made such a difference, and I'm sure people are going to go back to these talks and just appreciate that they exist and that those ideas are out there for us to engage with. So thank you again.